It's been an eventful summer split this year in the LCK, but unfortunately this week we'll be saying goodbye to a number of teams and players. From everyone here at the Inside on Esports Foundation, we thank you for the memories.
It will be the last time we ever have to talk about them. Thank God. I will never have to talk about Fred and Brian for the rest of this year, or Nongshim Red Force, or Hanwha Life, or the Guangdong Freaks. I will not miss any of them at all. Will I miss any players from them?
Yeah.
No.
You will.
Keen. I'll miss Keen.
You'll miss Keen.
That's it. I think he's the only one I'm going to miss.
Not BDD?
No, I don't like BDD. As usual, the Monte and Wolf Show is brought to you by esportsbet.io. Stay tuned this next week. Thorn and I have got a lot coming for you for the summer playoffs for League of Legends. We are going to be playing for you guys. If we win, you guys are going to win prizes or some really fun stuff that has never been seen in esports before. We will be making this announcement in the coming week or so before those summer playoffs begin, so stay tuned. Welcome to the final regular season edition of the Monte and Wolf Show this year. Thank you once again to Adanian, our editor, for that beautiful introduction memorializing the fallen teams of the LCK. We are saying goodbye for this year to Fred and Brian, the Guangdong Freaks, Nongshim Red Force, and Hanwha Life. So
very, very sad.
I did like the Chad, the Chad images over Fred and Brian, and the ending with BDD. After this last week, I'm not sure if I am going to miss Keen, actually, because he was extra bad.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll miss Nongshim though now, because they at least finished strong. At the end of the day, they won their last two series. They looked less pathetic than normal. They in fact took a game off T1 and DRX the previous week. So maybe this was the team that we wanted to see all along. Not sure what their problems were besides effort being completely terrible most of the time. The rest of them, Ghost, BDD, Dread, Kana, not that bad. So
hey,
at least we got to see them win a few games at the end of this. If
season. Kana can play Renekton and he could play strong side top, and Ghost can just kind of farm in the bottom lane, the team works. Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, that's what we wanted. But it wasn't a top meta. And so Kana was just a tank, and Ghost had to do things, and he couldn't, and his supports were bad. And BDD, rest in peace. You said you didn't like him. I liked BDD this year. I thought he did his best. Okay.
Was he your favorite player that you will not be seeing anymore in 2022?
Yeah, maybe. I think so. Although after watching Kana yesterday, he's up there too. It's a Renekton meta now, apparently, and he was very good at it.
Okay, so Nongshim Red Force, they at least finished somewhat strong, which is a good thing because this team definitely deserved to be more competitive over the course of this split. They were probably, I would say, the biggest disappointment of this LCK season. I hope we actually get to see good things from them in the future. Hopefully they get a support player that can play support and synergy. I mean, synergy and shot calling was really probably their single biggest issue.
Yeah, I think that's like the clear hole that a lot of our teams that are not doing well in the LCK had, was just a lack of shot calling and strong support. We saw Nongshim in particular had this glaring issue, but I think that was also pretty true for Hanwha Life. Like Vista was very up and down. If he wasn't playing a Mumu Kalista, he didn't look very good. And the support role I think was incredibly important this year because it was a slow meta, or this season I should say. It was a slow meta where eventually you need someone to engage, and if the tank does it alone, or if there's not a good setup for the tank and the support to engage, then the tank just dies alone and you lose the fight. Otherwise, you can't do anything and you just play passively, which was a huge problem for the Kwangdong Freaks as well, who we were also saying goodbye to. And they also had a multi-support problem, the same way Nongshim did, where they had both Moham and Hoyt swapping back and forth repeatedly, and neither of them really solidified their position as who was the stronger support, and they both looked middling to weak throughout the season.
But they accomplished the defeat of Faker and ended the T1 win streak. So at least they will have that notch in their belt, right? At the end of the day, they did get to play Orin mid. Hoyt, who was terrible this season, somehow managed to be kind of okay on Seraphine, enough to beat T1. So I think that is the feather in their cap, if nothing else, for what was mostly a bad season. They at least did manage to beat T1 and end the insane win streak that they were on.
There you go. That's going to be on Hoyt's Leaguepedia page, like at the bottom. Like, little known facts about Hoyt: was involved in ending T1's win streak. There you go.
That was the one bright spot to his career.
Achievement unlocked.
No, but seriously though, like I really, credit to Kwangdong. They were creative enough to figure out some of these strategies. They really unleashed Seraphine on the LCK. They had a profound effect on the meta, really, in the bans especially, which is more than we can really say of the other teams that didn't make playoffs.
Yeah, that's true. For Hanwha and Frederic Brion, they made very little impact on the meta or the LCK in general. And if we're going to shift gears to Frederic Brion for a second, I thought that when we were in the Corki meta at the very beginning of the season, considering how good Lava has been historically on the champion, and how slow the meta was, where Frederic Brion had gotten most of their wins with basically less than 1,000 gold difference for 30 minutes, and then they win a big soul fight where they had Drake control, they win a big Elder fight, win that 50-50. That was kind of their MO and how they got to playoffs in the previous season. So I thought they were going to be very good. I was very bullish on Frederic Brion. Not that they were going to be like a top 4 team necessarily, or a real title contender, but I thought they would go to playoffs again for sure, and they absolutely did not. And Henna had a pretty weak season, even considering it's a Kalista meta. He didn't get to play it that often and didn't show up big at all, really. He had a pretty weak season. Delight is trapped in this team. I think Delight might actually be one of the players who goes somewhere else and does great things one day.
So I think what's interesting to me about Frederic Brion is that they almost managed to go an entire round robin without winning a match. And then in the very last game of the first round robin, that's when they defeat Nongshim Red Force. Their only wins were two matches against Nongshim Red Force and 1 win against Hanwha Life, the only team lower than them in the standings. So overall, obviously very unimpressive. I never was really as high on Lava as other people have been in the past. And, Morgan was there. It is kind of a meme roster of pieces that have been discarded from other teams. Sword. At the end of the day. I have always disliked Sword ever since Griffin put him in for Worlds. Doran wasn't good at that time either. But, making that change did not actually provide a lot of benefits to Griffin. So I still partially blame him for that terrible Worlds.
Yeah, I think I mean, he's also just, I don't want to say washed up, but I kind of want to say washed up. Like, he's not really a competitive top laner right now. He's had like 2 or 3 decent games this year. He hasn't played that much either, to be fair. Fred Brion has kind of somewhat randomly subbed him in, it feels like, in matches that are important too for their runs, and then he wins and they're like, all right, that's it, you're out. It's like, what? I don't actually understand. It wasn't even a specific niche pick that he was playing. It didn't really make sense. And I'm actually close with some of the management and coaching staff of Fred Brion. I've asked them about this, and they're like, we don't really want to reveal that. I'm like, okay, well, I don't know. I guess we're just never gonna know why you put Sword in or why you didn't. But anyway, that wasn't very critical for this season this time because he played very little. But yeah, I think that Lava last season, in my mind, was a top 4 mid laner. Like, his LeBlanc was incredible, his Vex was good, his Corki was good. But now his Veigar was very good, obviously. But now, he didn't make a huge impact on Azir or the meta champions in the later part of the season. His Sylas was, he didn't even really play it that much. They didn't prioritize it very highly. Not a great season for him. And I don't know if Fred and Brian will stay together or not. They stayed together for a very long time, this roster. So on paper, you would think the synergy should have gotten better, and the the teamwork and the mechanics that naturally come with playing professional League of Legends for a long period of time usually leads to a big growth. And sometimes you could see a team like this have a big resurgence because of all the other roster shuffles that are happening around, like Nongshim and Kwangdong Freaks making big changes. But no, they didn't actually go to the upper echelon. They didn't make it. And let's talk about our last one, Hanwha Life.
Hey, they ended strong, man. They beat
They also almost went
DRX.
Yeah, they also almost went winless in the second round robin, but they won
did it the last one. And look, I'm not going to read into it too much because DRX literally had nothing to play for in this situation. They were locked into the 6th seed in the playoffs. I never read into teams who lose in that kind of scenario because even though they could have tied the match record with KT, they could not have actually surpassed them in terms of map differential, game score. So I don't know. Like, DRX also limped through the end of this season. Like, they look like they've been completely solved. I think, to me, if I had to glean one thing from this, is that Hanwha Life played compositions that we probably will see LiiV SANDBOX play, such as Renekton, Vi, Sylas, Kalista, Amumu, Draven, these kind of champions. These sound like LiiV SANDBOX compositions, and Hanwha Life was beating DRX, which means that I have very low faith that DRX is going to beat LiiV SANDBOX in these playoffs.
Yeah, I was saying it on the cast. I was incorrectly saying I didn't think they were going to beat KT because of KT's playstyle is also similar, but that was the wrong part of the bracket. It's actually LiiV SANDBOX they face, and just the way this series goes wrong for DRX on so many levels, I think it's rough. We'll talk about playoffs in a moment, but Hanwha, they went budget this year, like super hard. And I can respect it, sort of. I mean, when you consider
why,
well, when you consider the potential for developing these players and the talent they may potentially have, like Vista has had some high highs, right? And he's stuck with this roster. They had Chovy obviously in the past. They've had so many talented players in the past. They had Viper Lens at one point. And I think Hanwha, as an org, decided, like, okay, we spent a lot of money on Chovy last year. We went to Worlds. But let's see what happens if we go budget and see if we could develop some players. It didn't work. And this is an organization, Hanwha Life, which is a subsection of Hanwha, which is a massive company in Korea.
Yes.
Is the life insurance part of the of this sect. They're gonna
have to pay out because Hanwha's dead, man.
This joke has been made many a time for us, like in the backstage area of the LCK studio.
How much do they have to pay when they die before playoffs? That's an early death, man. That's probably a lot of money.
So, what I'm getting at is they're gonna have to pay out for next year because I don't think that as a company, like as a marketing branch of this company, I just don't see a world in which you're happy being the worst team in the LCK multiple times in a row, and your brand is on that, and you're like 1-17 in the LCK.
Plus, the jokes write themselves, as we said, so probably not a good factor for them.
Yeah, I think that it's time to spend money. Like the parent company they're loaded. They have big money. It's time to buy some Korean players that are good and make a power run and make a super team. I think. I do not think this roster should stay together. I don't think this roster works well together at all. I don't think this roster is I don't think the players even look like they like each other. Like, I don't think there's like a family atmosphere. On Fred Brion, you could at least be like, oh, the Giga Chads over there, like Fred Brion sticks together, you know? This team is a family, right? No, over at Hanwha Life, you're like, ooh, these players are hoping they're going to find a contract somewhere else. I don't think anybody wants to be on this team. And individually, the players are not great, but they're also not, it's not like it's a team of 5 Hoyts or something where you're like, oh, this is hopeless. You know, I think there is a chance for these players to do something somewhere else. But not on this team anymore. And I hope I don't have to cast 2 more round robins even of this roster ever again. Because I think the players deserve better than this. The org deserves better than this. And please just spend money and make a roster that is worthy of the LCK. Because you would be relegated 100%. Challenger teams could probably beat this roster if we were not in franchising. You'd be gone. Just straight up.
Wow. Well, no love lost there for this version of Hanwha Life Esports. May they rise again next year and do much better with better players. No, so may they swap out all of their internal organs and rise again a new body.
That's the hope. Praying in chat here.
All right. So now that we've covered our eulogies for those teams, doesn't sound like anybody is going to be missing this crop of teams and players over much. Let's discuss the playoffs, because I also, at this point, am not going to be missing one of these playoff teams, which is DRX. I had such high hopes for this team. They looked like they were doing very cool things at the start of the split. They were one of the only successful Callista teams. We got to see Kingen like absolutely shitting on people with Ornn, and that was really fun there for a while. That was really fun. And then in this second round robin, despite the fact that they still have DAMWON Kia's number, and more on that soon, they managed to really perform quite poorly against the other rosters that are going to be playing in these playoffs.
Yeah.
They lost to
all of them.
Except for DAMWON. They lost to all of them.
Except for DAMWON, they lost to all of them. And they will lose to Liiv SANDBOX again. 3-0, I expect, in that first quarterfinal match. It would be a crazy upset if DRX beats Liiv SANDBOX there, and would then, like, I can think, change our minds and opinions on what could happen if they go to Worlds. Like, it would be just a LCK changing moment. But it's not going to happen. They're not going to turn lead into gold on this series, I don't think. The matchups they have too, like the one weak point I think for Liiv SANDBOX, the one weak point but also somewhat strong point, is they have Dove in the top lane, who is never going to win it for you, but he's definitely not going to lose the lane, and he will survive under turret, so they can make plays on the bottom side. They can play around closer in the mid lane. And Krako has been somewhat inconsistent, but more consistent recently on the good side of things. And I think when we talk about what happens for Liiv SANDBOX later in the playoff bracket, we can talk about Dove as a liability, but Kingen, he's not the guy.
He's not the Dove killer.
He's not the Dove killer.
He's not there. He's not there to strangle some doves. That's very true, because when this guy isn't playing a tank, he is extremely underwhelming. And I think really the comparison that we have to make is Liiv SANDBOX to KT Rolster, because they've suddenly become really similar teams in certain ways, except KT is is definitely more dangerous in the top side with Rascal. And I think the positive aspect of this for Liiv SANDBOX is that the longer things have gone on, Closer has stepped up, so they're not quite as one-dimensional as they used to be. But even so, I would say Vikla is the superior mid laner, because I think Vikla has shown really good versatility across like Ahri, Sylas, Azir, these meta picks, where like I'm not completely sold on closer on some of these control mages. So it just feels like Liiv SANDBOX, yes, they are very good at what they do. We saw them this last week take out T1. Now, it wasn't the most meaningful match, again, because T1 could not get first place because Genji had already beaten Fred at Brion, so it was actually impossible. But I am concerned when I see T1 continue to play Swain and Jinx and Blitzcrank, and these feel like old picks in certain ways from them. Meanwhile, Liiv SANDBOX just completely steamrolled T1. Like they snowballed from the early game extremely effectively in this series, and it was not close.
Yeah, and it's not the kind of game from T1 where we have seen some happy gaming, as we like to call it at the LCK from T1, where the bottom duo is playing some wild comp, and win or lose, the players are laughing and high-fiving. Yeah, we played Wukong support, haha, like kind of thing. And then in this series, like nobody's laughing when they're losing with the Swain Blitzcrank. Like nobody's laughing, nobody's smiling. The players are looking very angry. The comms seem very silent. It's one of those moments where you could tell the players are like not playing a for fun gaming moment. They are not having the, yeah, well, this match doesn't matter. We don't care. We're just going to have fun. That was a great series. I really enjoyed that. They looked very frustrated. And I think they thought the Swain pick was good. I have very different opinions about Swain than Chronicler does right now. Like, Chronicler actually thinks the pick is still strong, and we've had some discussions about this on broadcast and off broadcast, actually. We did a TriCast recently. We talked about it a little bit. I think Swain doesn't really have a strong place in this meta unless your comp is so snowbally that you're going to be on top of the enemy team all the time, and the Swain's going to then get value. In that comp where Faker played it, they were severely outranged, and the Swain actually ruined what was otherwise a pretty serviceable draft, I thought. And I think it is dated. I think it does feel very old. And
I think
maybe they're hiding strats, but
I think the problem with that was not that the Swain was bad in principle, especially with the crowd control brought by Sejuani and Wukong, and also serving as an additional frontliner for Jinx. So that theory works out. But I think you're right on when you say that the problem is the range of Liiv SANDBOX. When you have Azir ult, Trundle Pillar, and Gragas ult disengage, and a Tahm Kench to save somebody, there's just no way this Swain stays in that front line. He's just going to get pushed out. So I think if you took T1's composition in isolation, you could say, okay, I see the theory behind this, but it's like they weren't reacting to the picks that were coming in from Liiv SANDBOX, and so the comp just doesn't work against Liiv SANDBOX's comp.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to a certain extent, like I was saying before, I think there's a world where maybe T1 just don't want to show what they think is strong on 12-14, and so they're kind of like, okay, let's play this comp that's, serviceable. It maybe doesn't work here, but maybe we can pull it off. Doesn't matter. This is an argument you can make. I'm not trying to say this is what happened, but maybe there's an argument for the T1 just being like, hide strats, don't show anything, play this comp. If we're lucky, we win. If we lose, Kespa's not going to be investigating us for match fixing because we didn't care about the game. Like it's a comp you can play. And like, because obviously you can't just show. I mean, I am joking, of course, to make it clear for those who don't understand sarcasm in the comments, but you do have to play to win every game that's in the rule book. But yeah, I mean, if you're T1, you want to just play a comp and see if it works and then move on to the next series. Sandbagging, if you will, as Monte likes to call it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, just like DRX, we talked about, like, yeah, I have some concerns because they lost to something that looks a lot like what Liiv SANDBOX would play. But at the same time, DRX probably wasn't trying their hardest to win that game. And I can't imagine T1 was trying to try their hardest to win this game either. However, they did look like they wanted to win versus DAMWON Kia. So that's why I'm like a little reluctant here, because there was nothing on the line really in that game either. Yeah.
And they also had that near loss to Nongshim in the previous week, which the T1 players looked very, like the coordination was very poor in that series. And Keria looked very upset visibly in that game. He was playing Renata and trying to like carry. And then we saw Zayas play Zac top, which he's been playing a lot in solo queue. So maybe it was his moment to be like, all right, well, let's hide strats by also I'm going to play this weird pick that I think is kind of good, but maybe not. I'm not going to play this in playoffs, but he played Prowler's Claw at Renekton in a comp where he needed to actually be a frontline and not a diving champion in that game. And he also didn't get ahead on the Renekton, which you need to do to actually pull off the Prowler's Claw itemization. So he wasn't even ahead to where he could snowball with it or make a threat. That series was very worrying. And then they lost to LiiV SANDBOX 2-0. And then they were like, all right, we're going to beat DAMWON Kia. And they come up and show up big in that series in their final match. But it was very puzzling, that LiiV SANDBOX loss. And I don't want to read too much into it, but I will read into that loss, their Nongshim series, the series before that. I can't even remember which one it was, but they didn't look very clean in. I just feel like there's a trend of T1 being very inconsistent right now. It does worry me a little bit.
Well, also, I think when we look at the DAMWON Kia game, it just seemed like LiiV SANDBOX had a better read on T1, because if you're looking at their bans coming into this series, like that's when the Draven bans are coming out versus Gumayusi. That's when the Kalista bans are coming out versus Gumayusi. And yeah, Gumayusi hasn't been great on Kalista this season. Like he hasn't been, but when you look at what happens when some of these early game AD carries are available, as DAMWON Kia left up, especially that Draven, you can see why teams have been so concerned about Gumayusi's Draven. I don't think it gets left up for the playoffs, but if T1 can snowball out of the bot lane, which they did in both of these games, part of that was DAMWON throwing a lead that they had in game number 1 and like allowing the Samira to get back into it, because DAMWON wanted to fight for a useless dragon. There's literally no reason to fight for the second dragon. Remember, DAMWON had taken the first dragon, so there wasn't really a threat of stacking, and they got a lead, and then they just completely giga through it at the second dragon, playing into a choke point versus Samira and Ornn. So, I mean, that's a DAMWON mistake, but you can see that if you do give T1 advantages with some of these early game AD carries, they can accelerate the game really fast on you. And I just don't think you allow that. Because if LiiV SANDBOX said, okay, we want to play the scaling game with you, you're not going to get these lane bullies necessarily. And even though I would argue those games never really got into the scaling state, like without T1 being able to get a hold on the game, LiiV SANDBOX just crushed them, just smashed them.
And I think that T1 are so reliant on Guma being on a prio lane carry, like where he has push in the lane, be that the Kalista or the Draven. And I agree that I think Guma's laning has been fairly weak, but I think when he has just by default the better matchup, those weaknesses aren't as apparent because he's playing a winning lane. He's not going to mess it up. He's not going to overextend. Some team fight stuff on the Draven and on the Kalista has been suspect at times, but usually T1 has operated all year long on getting lane prio, getting early objective control, usually on Herald, and then snowballing leads from cross-map plays and avoiding those poor fights like DAMWON took. T1 won't take that. They'll push topside. They'll look for a dive somewhere else. They've been so good at that all year long. But now all teams have realized, well, if Guma's on a lane where he actually has to play safe or make some complex choices with Keria, he might do the wrong thing. We might get a 2v2 down there. We might be able to play the jungle matchup. Because Owner is also not playing Poppy and Trundle as much as other junglers.
Yep.
So the 3v3 is weaker for T1, and if they just don't have that default prio for Guma, you put him on like an Aphelios, it gets really awkward for him because he can't just default win. He actually has to kind of skill it in the lane matchup, and he gets left out on an island by Owner who plays elsewhere. And then Faker is also not playing champions where he has a lot of roam power. Recently, he did a lot earlier in the season, so did Showmaker. But it's a meta where you're kind of trying to push mid lane prio and then finally roam, but like you're kind of on your own as Guma Keria. So when teams identified that he needs to be on these pushing lanes, T1 has looked weaker as a result. They haven't been able to have that same sort of snowbally set of advantages that they were so successful with in spring and to the beginning of summer as well. So I think T1 look a little bit exposed right now, and maybe we're reading a little bit too much into these series that don't matter, quote unquote, but I don't think so. I think that I can't see another way T1 plays this, and Zeus has also been, notice that Zeus, even though he was for most people a big MVP candidate for the first round robin, everyone's like, this guy's the greatest top laner we've ever seen in so long. Like, he's coming in, everybody's talking about him, but he's actually had quite a poor second half of the season, and in the last few weeks he has. And notice no one is targeting him in the draft. No one is trying to put him down in the draft. And I wonder if Zeus will be able to play Renekton or Aatrox even, which he has not, if I'm not mistaken, played at all yet this season, to get topside prio if they don't get those carries bottom. So I think it's really easy to draft against T1. Like, oh, okay, like, we'll wait for the mid counter pick. We can play Renekton into Zeus. He might struggle there. He probably he hasn't looked good on Renekton. He hasn't played Aatrox. And if we could just ban Guma, feels like a pretty easy way to approach the draft right now, unless T1 has something they're hiding, which we haven't seen yet.
I do wonder, too, because we've seen Zeus really go harder into these tanks, and maybe that's the only way their team is working right now. But it does seem weird when the Gwen is still strong and readily available, and Zeus is an extremely good Gwen player, that they would not be prioritizing this champion or trying to play more topside, because it's not like it isn't an option. But I have to assume that's because if Gumayushi doesn't get a lot of support, if Gumayushi and Keria don't get a lot of support, they are just losing scrims. That's the only thing I can assume, because Zeus shouldn't be shoehorned into just playing tanks a lot.
Yeah, it's very odd, and it makes me wonder if not. I mean, I don't know how to word this, but almost like T1 has lost their faith in his ability to play these champions because of scrim results and because of the recent results in play he's shown. Because they are just putting him on tank duty. But that means that in this meta where prio is so important, other teams have really strong top laners. Like Dove, that's not him, but Doran has looked very good when he's on strong side. And Rascal is insane. And even honestly, Nuggery could be something like if they end up facing off against DAMWON Kia. I don't think that's going to happen. We're not predicting that, but if they run into Nuggery, I think that could be also a place where Zeus struggles if Nuggery is given a Renekton or an Aatrox, because he's been very good on those champions throughout his career in the early parts of DAMWON gaming and stuff like that. So Zeus has to show up big time, I think, in the matchup T1 is playing, regardless of who it's going to be, because it's really easy to just say, no, Guma, you're not playing Draven, you're not playing Kalista, and you're not going to get a Yuumi lane. It's not going to happen. I just don't think that'll ever happen in any best of 5 T1 plays in that semifinal or potentially in the finals. So they're going to have to find another avenue. And I think it's going to have to be on the top side, because Faker has also been fine in terms of his late game team fighting and also his skirmishing, but his laning has not looked as dominant as Mykles recently. And I would argue that Chovy is pretty significantly ahead of him. I think versus closer, that one's a little bit closer for sure. And it also feels like a really sick matchup we could have, because they're former teammates, of course. And Closer played behind Faker. But we'll have to wait and see. So I think right now, for me, I'm pretty happy to predict a 3-0 for both quarterfinals.
Wow. So you think 3-0 KT over DAMWON?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I'll stop you there. Look, I think KT is the best team in these quarterfinals, but I don't think they're going to 3-0 DAMWON Kia. I am not willing to go out and predict that a rookie like Vikla is going to show the same poise in a best of 5 that players like Canyon, Nuggery, and Showmaker. Like, I'm not willing to do that. Before we talk about DAMWON, though, we should touch on KT, because KT is a super interesting team, especially with the results from this past week. And for me, sure, I've always been a KT fan, right? But what I will say is that I think this team probably deserved to beat Liiv SANDBOX when they played Liiv SANDBOX. I think that had Rascal not kind of run it down in the mid lane at that Dragon Soul fight, that it was kind of KT's game. They certainly had all the vision control and everything that they possibly needed in order to make that work for them. So I don't know. I think this is really interesting, but I think KT still probably comes out on top for me. if anything, I feel like KT loses to themselves, like in that instance, or when they played a very close series with Gen G this past week, which was important for both Gen G and them to win, just to kind of keep T1 at bay, as it were.
And also for Gen G's record, like them breaking the record. The best game score, which they did by just one game.
Yeah, they had already locked in first place, but I do think it was kind of relevant for Gen G, and it was certainly relevant potentially for KT, who could have surpassed DAMWON in the standings, right?
Yeah, now DAMWON will have like side selection for game 1, which is really important.
Yeah, so and anyway, this is all to say KT decided to play Nilah in the third game of the series, which I am pretty out on as a champion, and not because I think Nilah is necessarily bad, but because here are the problems when you play Nilah. It forces you to play a very different kind of game. And
you cannot win the lane. You are not winning the lane. It is not going to happen.
Right. It forces you to play a very different kind of game. And when you play with a Sylas, Wukong, Renekton, Nilah composition with a Nami, and by the way, you're only playing Nami because you tried to steal it away from them playing Lucian Nami, right? So it's not like, okay, this is a Taric, which is a strong support with Nilah. Not to say that Nami's bad, but like there are better choices, right? And you're playing all of these melee champs into Ornn, Ahri, and Lucian, and they have a Soraka just to heal the team, right? Like you don't have any kind of range advantage, and you just get picked apart, and you get counter engaged on, and you lose. And you need something like a Taric ult to allow you to survive long enough to close that gap and do team fight effectively. And they really didn't have anything to make that work for them.
Yeah, that game felt like KT were just like, well, we're going to have a for fun game. When they picked the Nami away, it felt like such a rookie mistake. Like such a weird, like we've seen teams go like, oh man, we messed up. We let Lucian through. We have to pick Nami away. We've seen it happen like twice before this. And it got completely bodied. Like it was awful. Like it didn't work at all. It looked shit. And it was in this game as well. And the, like I was trying so hard in that cast to try to pretend like there was a way that this could go well. Like I was like, I don't know, like they're gonna hit 6 first maybe, and like they got that extra experience, and there's an all in with Nilah's ult and Nami ult, and then they did the all in like the second they hit 6. But Peanut was there and they died, and then it was like, all right, the game is over, I think.
Well, it's just that why I hate this pick is like even if you can win with it, the problem with the Nilah is that to be in the best possible scenario, your bot lane has to practice with it, which takes up practice time with normal champions. Your team has to practice with it very specifically, so it requires your team to play differently, and then it requires your support player to have experience with supports that are, in this meta, pretty much only good with Nilah. And you commit all of this time to doing these things, and then it can be solved just by banning Nilah. So where is this go? Like, what is the point of spending all of this effort practicing Nilah if it's just a waste of time for a professional team?
If
like your best case scenario is you pull it out, you win one game of a best of 5, and then it gets banned, and then it's over. And then where did all that practice time go?
If you are Gen G or T1 and you think it's very good and you have the extra time because you are already seeded into the semifinals and you want to keep it as a pocket pick, and you're already like Gen G or T1, a very dominant team, and losing some of that practice time doesn't matter as much.
Right.
I think maybe there's a world, one game in a best of 5, like, but it doesn't seem like the kind of pick that's going to get the same value as the Karthus we saw from Canyon, for example, or maybe a rare Fiddlesticks we might see. That sort of pick, I think, is really strong right now, whereas Nilah feels like just so forced to try to play it in this meta. And I didn't like that, but I don't want to read too much into that series because it was a Nami pick away, or too much into that game in the series because it was a Nami pick away, and it was, I don't know, just it seemed like KT were also laughing and kind of giggling. Like that was the angle for where you see the players and you're like, oh, okay, the players are having a for fun game here.
Yeah.
So I think the reason why I go 3-0 is I think that Cuz is someone that like somehow just across this entire year, no one has like even said his name once. Like I feel like I'm the first person who's ever said Cuz's name like right here, right now. No one has even discussed him at all because he was so middling or weak for so long. He was never what this team was about. He was never like a key part of this roster. Because Aiming was just playing weak side AD carry. He wasn't getting ahead because Cuz was having some sick ganks and feeding him kills or anything like that. It was a tank versus tank top meta, and Cuz was just farming the jungle and looking for engages later on in the fights. But Cuz has changed as a player a lot. He's being a lot more aggressive. He's playing around topside. He's playing around Rascal extremely well. His pathing has been very good. And I look at Canyon and I'm like, you're kind of behind Cuz right now. And I never thought I would say those words, but I think it's true at this moment in time. Canyon's current form versus Cuz's pathing, Cuz's ability to read the meta and play around his winning lanes extremely well, play around Prio really well, makes me feel like that's why I don't think DAMWON Kia will get an AO. Because yeah, they have Showmaker, they have Nugri, they have Duckdom and Kellen, maybe Bible, but probably not. They have a really strong roster.
Speaking of which, what do you know why Bible wasn't playing?
I do not know. I asked and I wasn't given an answer. I do not know why he wasn't playing. But the assumption when I ask people on the Korean side is, looks like it was just Kellen had COVID and he didn't want to play because he was sick. Whereas in the past, most people were leaning towards, as we were, the Bible was being played as a shot caller and they were going to try to develop this roster for playoffs and the Worlds qualifier and then potentially have him at Worlds to change the shot calling of the team. And that was kind of like a theory everybody agreed on. They were all like, yeah, I think so, high five, yeah. But then it just apparently didn't actually pan out that way. So nobody knows, or I mean, I know DAMWON knows, but they haven't told anyone. I haven't been able to talk to DAMWON about it, but I've asked the Korean analysts, and I've asked people at Riot if did they give any reason, because sometimes Riot will interview the teams before matches and they'll get like some insight into stuff like this. There wasn't any. They didn't give any answers about that.
I'm just surprised because the comms seemed a lot different with Bible in there, being a very active shot caller. And yeah, he kind of fell on his face in their first match, but then they almost beat Gen G in his second match ever on the professional stage. So I was expecting them to at least continue to try and use him. But I guess they are just going to regress. And like, frankly, when they hit T1, their shot calling looked a lot worse than when they played Gen G.
Yeah, I think so. And shot calling looks worse. Duckdom is a veteran. Showmaker and Nugri are insane veterans, right? They have so much experience. But I don't think it'll matter because they're not currently in dominant form. And it's so sad, actually, especially in this meta, to me, that Showmaker, his whole thing, like his whole career, his whole shtick was, I got mid prio, I'm winning it. That's what I'm doing. They picked Lucian for me again. I'm pushing the lane in. I'm roaming. I'm getting value somewhere else. I'm snowballing my bot lane. I'm keeping Ghost alive down there. I'm going to make a play. And especially before teleport was nerfed, he was everywhere. The guy was like, I got lanes pushing. I'm teleporting top. I'm teleporting bot. I'm going anywhere. I'm ready to fight. In this meta where Prio has become important again, he's losing lane. Like, he's not winning. He's not actually... I think he will lose to Vikla. I just think that will happen. I think that's what I would predict. And I think I'm going to be right. And Nugri as well, the same type of player, like abusing Klepto, insane laning power, had the highest forward percentage for a lot of this season. And I think he probably still is like top 3 in that. But because he is so forward, he is getting ganked a lot. He's dying a lot. He's trying to make impactful plays, but isn't given the champions to do so. Like his Sejuani with Ignite it was really cool the first few times where he was finding success. And now it's kind of like, is that all you can do up there? And he hasn't looked as good on the other champions. He hasn't looked good on Ornn. And then I look at Rascal and I'm like, this is an interesting matchup for sure in terms of the player names here in Nugri's history, but I have to give the edge to Rascal. I have to give the edge to Cuz. I have to give the edge to Vikla. Okay, there's an AD carry on the bottom side called Duckdom who's been pretty good on Aphelios. Oh, but it's Aiming on the other side too. Like, it just doesn't look good for DAMWON across the board.
Yeah, look, I think that if I'm DAMWON, they still are the wild card, right? They still have all of these potential flex picks. They could at any time be extremely dangerous. KT is going to have some less experienced players. The upside, I think, with Rascal is that while Rascal has been recently dominant, especially in a 1v1 capacity. If you look at like last split, the Rascal's problem was that he wasn't really a team player. And what's different now is that Rascal is actually changing lanes, swapping bot, putting on map pressure, playing with his team a lot better. He looks like his macro sense has grown significantly. And I think to me, that is, he now he still has certain games, like when they lost to Liiv SANDBOX, where he just randomly walks away and does his own Rascal thing, even if it's an objectively terrible idea, and that can lose you games. But it's rarer that happens now. And so you're getting a lot of that lane dominance and a lot of that solo kill potential with a player that seems to have a better idea of where his teammates are on the map and is willing to play successfully around that pressure without dying, which previously I would say was a problem.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the shot calling for KT is really interesting because watching it in the glimpses we get in the open mics and stuff like that, it seems like Cuz is quite important to their team in terms of the communication, which was really surprising to me because in the past he's been just unfortunately kind of middling or below middling, like I was saying earlier. And it seems like he's really just thinking about the game in a smarter way. And Acorn is in the coaching staff for KT Rolster and someone you've cast, of course, in the past.
Oh, yeah.
And until the very recent history, it's been Hirai, who was a StarCraft coach and has coached a ton of teams to great success. He was a Longzhu coach as well. He was incredible Miracles coach in StarCraft, and then in their short run in League of Legends, that's kind of how he got started. I think he's an incredible coach. But he, like Koma, has kind of now been designated to head coach, which means he's making like bigger, grander decisions. He's essentially like running the team in terms of the big macro sense, but he's not actually standing behind the players in draft anymore. And I think since that change was made, because I think, Hirai he's getting older, he's, getting paid more, he's moving up in KT like significantly. I think it was more important for Acorn and Supreme to take a bigger role in terms of the coaching. And ever since Hirai stepped off the stage, it feels like KT have gone up and up. And I'm not trying to say Hirai was the problem. I actually have the utmost respect for this guy. But I think having an ex-pro being the coach for KT has changed how they communicate, changed how they draft, and they've looked a lot stronger as a result. I can't tell you guys what Acorn says on stage. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, so this is just my theory. Like, I don't have any proof of this. But it's just a trend I noticed, and they do look more coordinated, like you say. Rascal's making the right macro decisions, whereas DAMWON on the other side, without Canyon being dominant, it really does feel like DAMWON was so much more reliant on Canyon than they were on Khan, and then they were on Ghost, obviously on the bottom side of the map, than they were on Beryl. When Canyon has not looked good in terms of his pathing and his just overall mechanics, although he did have one of the most incredible plays of all time just a few days ago. Beyond that, like,
that was very
DAMWON
impressive.
looked lost. DAMWON looked lost without him, though. And I don't know what happens to this roster. I don't know if they stay together. Maybe they make an incredible Worlds run because, as you say, they've got a lot of pocket picks potentially to show. This has been Canyon's whole thing this season. We've talked about it many times on this show. I think he's hiding stuff. Like, he has a huge jungle pool. He wasn't playing just Viego Wukong all the time at the beginning of the season. He was playing Kiana.
It's also confusing to me because DAMWON Kia didn't actually pull out the Taliyah last week at all, where Talia has been a pretty consistent ban against Showmaker throughout this split. It hasn't been there, and like that. What's so dangerous about this pick is that we know what DAMWON, they can flex it as well. So like it's a particularly dangerous pick to let DAMWON have, and it wasn't banned. They didn't pick it. It makes me wonder if DAMWON is really playing their style that they're actually good at. That's what it makes me wonder.
Yeah, I think there is definitely I think we are definitely going to see some really exciting drafts from them in this series, and maybe that's what throws KT off. Maybe that's the angle. Maybe that's how DAMWON wins one game at least, potentially in this series. I can't predict that, but I think it would be very cool and very fun, and I think you might be onto something here. We saw the Karthus pick, which worked out extremely well. I think we could see like a Fiddlesticks potentially, because Fiddlesticks is pretty strong right now, although he's not very good at controlling the early game because He's very squishy, and you can just actually get totally gapped in the jungle because of that. If you end up getting killed with a roam from the mid lane, you fall behind, then you just lose your whole jungle, you lose the game. I think we could see Renekton and Italy out of them once or twice in this best of 5. Like, I could see Canyon pull at one of his best champions historically, play Renekton for Nuggery on the top side. Like, I think that's not out of the question. But you can only get away with that kind of drafting like once in a best of 5. So
I mean, the thing is, they have so much versatility though that they only have to do it once, right? And even though the last time they met a couple weeks ago was a 2-0 for KT, both of those games were like 45-minute long games. That's why it's hard for me to think that KT is going to 3-0. Like, it's difficult to believe that DAMWON is not going to take at least one game in this series. I think this is a 5-game series.
Yeah, the other casters kind of agree with you as well that they think it's going to be much closer. I think maybe I have too much faith in KT right now, but
no, it's just a scenario, Wolf. Like, this is a time where that veteran nature of DAMWON Kia can really show, and it's always really difficult when you have a team that has this level of experience and composure in a best of 5, not thinking that they can actually like pick it up against, especially a player like Vikla, who's so important to KT that is a rookie, right?
Since I have joined the LCK as a color commentator, the playoffs have been kind of terrible. Like, they have been pretty one-sided. We did have that amazing DAMWON series with Gen G last season.
Yep.
That's it. That's the one.
Yep.
And otherwise, it has been.
I mean, well, I can tell you from casting many Korean playoffs that they are rarely close. You know, we had so many 3-0 finals while I was casting. It was a treat to get a 5-game final, and it was rare.
Yeah, and so from my experience, I think people often predict like 3-2 is a way someone will do a prediction where they're like, I think it will be close. But I like very rarely will ever predict a 3-2 because it is so rare, or a 4-3 in a best of 7 series, regardless of esport, because it is just so insanely rare. It is like a safer prediction to say 3-0, I think, than to say 3-2. People often do 3-2 as the safe prediction because, like, I think it'll be close. I'm like, but that, if you're really thinking that score's happen, you better have a good reason.
No, I do have a good reason
in
here.
this case.
I do have a good reason
in this case, though. And that's kind of like what I'm getting at here. The longer I'm talking about this is like, you actually have a good reason. Like, I can see that scenario, but I personally won't predict it. But I could see it, and I think this season, most of our LCK playoffs have been like, it looks like the quarterfinals is going to be close, but then like the teams that win will just get shreked in the semis, and we already know the top 2 teams are going to the finals. We already know this. This time, though, like, we've talked a lot about the quarters. I want to talk about the semis now because
before we do the semis, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with the semifinals. As you just heard, Wolf and I both think that KT is likely to pull off their victory over DAMWON Kia in the LCK playoffs. And guess what? Here on Esports Bet, we've got some very good odds for that. I am hoping KT isn't the razor cake for once. They've got 2.406 odds. We're going to go ahead and put $1,000 in USDT onto KT and hopefully get that big return. All right. We're back, and now we're going to talk. Good call. And now we're going to talk about the semifinals. It was an excellent time to get the break where we get the prediction in there, right? So that said, Gen G still is the overwhelming favorite to win the LCK. I think it would be very shocking if any team that wasn't Gen G won. They have, despite losing the one best of 3 series T1, they have actually gotten the highest map differential now in LCK history, even with that match loss. They lost 5 games over the course of this entire season. 3 of them were to T1. No, 2 of them were to T1, excuse me.
2-1 to T1, 1 to DAMWON.
Yes.
Yeah. And
2 to DAMWON, 2 to T1.
2 to DAMWON, that's right.
Yep.
I couldn't even remember. I'm like, when was the last time they lost?
DAMWON has always played them close. Like, they nearly lost the entire match to DAMWON. Like, let's be very clear. Like, that was very scary for Gen G. The matchup versus DAMWON does seem to mess with them for whatever reason. And then they lost 1 game to KT, came back, last game wasn't particularly close. So, 2 games to T1, 2 games to DAMWON, 1 game to KT. That is it. So they've only lost games to 3 different teams. So it does seem, especially if you are Gen G, and if we follow our predictions of Liiv SANDBOX and KT winning, Gen G probably will pick Liiv SANDBOX. I think KT is the more dangerous team.
I agree.
And regardless, I think if DAMWON Kia wins, Gen G still picks Liiv SANDBOX because that matchup hasn't been great for them.
So this is where things get interesting for me, because like I was saying before the break, like this is the one time where the 2 semifinal teams are not just walkover wins to the finals, to where you feel like, okay, yeah, the quarters were really interesting in terms of their own series, but like who cares because they're going to lose the semis. The semis are going to suck. I think the semis are going to be great this time. I also think Gen G will pick Liiv SANDBOX, and the main reason why is there are 2 players they will face in one matchup. Their names are Rascal or Dove. And Doran is as strong as he has been towards the latter part of the season, and as pretty good as he is on strong side champions like the Aatrox and Renekton. Aatrox a little bit less consistently. The matchup that he faces versus Rascal could be a huge weak link for Gen G, whereas actually the matchup against Dove makes Doran more of a strong link for Gen G and actually makes that matchup not an issue. It just removes the weakness.
And for me, like, and Ruler and Chovy are just much better versions of Prince and Closer. So like, why would you even be worried about those matchups?
Yeah, so
and Peanut's the better version of Krako.
That is why I think there is just no world in which Gen G picks KT. In terms of the top lane alone, but in terms of mid as well, like Vikla is a much bigger threat than Closer, in my opinion, in the solo lanes. And like I think it's about as basic as that. Like if you're thinking like Liiv SANDBOX is going to beat Gen G, or like have like if you're more worried about Liiv SANDBOX, I think you're like creating some weird mystical like excuse me, some mystical headcanon for like Liiv SANDBOX is just like luckier than Gen G or something, or Krako will just like randomly win. You got to be careful about this team. I think literally on paper, you look at the lane matchup, you look at how this 12-14 meta is being played with Prio, and I think KT is a way scarier opponent for Gen G. Just straight up. Like, I think we are getting a Telecom War semi for T1. Now, I guess we will say, like, if we're talking about who Gen G is going to pick, one team they will also absolutely not pick is if DAMWON Kia upsets KT. I don't think Gen G will pick them because their form will probably be top tier if they beat KT. Yes. And DAMWON has always played Gen G close, as you were talking about earlier. So I do not think there is any world they pick DAMWON Kia either, if DAMWON upsets.
Gen G does very well when they are dictating the pace of an early game and they have a strong sense of what they're very good at reading teams that are playing a standard meta. When shit gets weird, like it inevitably does with DAMWON Kia, sometimes Gen G feels like they don't really know what to do. I mean, they still won. Like, they figure it out eventually, but it is a lot more challenging for them overall. And there are very few teams in the world that have the kind of surprises that can pop out of DAMWON Kia. So I think that in and of itself makes them significantly more dangerous. And to talk about the KT versus T1, we have to rewind time to like talk about this entire year, because this has been a very close matchup every single time it has been played this year. Even in the undefeated spring season from T1, they almost lost to KT when KT was way worse than they are now. And indeed, as we've talked about previously on this show, it was that match that basically T1 like assimilated them like the Borg and then became like the good version of T1 that had figured out these long-range pick compositions. Here's the Vex, here's the Ahri, we're going to play, very aggressively into the sideline and get a kill from a million miles away. And that became the T1 style that then propelled them into MSI. Yeah. But that was KT and T1 almost losing to them that caused that situation. And then both of the matches that were played this split were 2-1 wins for T1 in what was some really, really close games.
Yeah, that was that series was when Aiming was playing AP Kaisa, and like T1 had that insanely close team fight where Guma just barely actually popped off and carried, and they barely won. And then T1 barely won in the first round robin against KT. Same with the second Telecom War this season. Both of the series were played close in summer. And like, if you like in my mind, like part of the reason why I started to feel like, okay, KT looks like a very strong team was how they played against T1. And I set T1 as kind of like a bar as, okay, Telecom War usually gets close games out of KT this season. But this time it actually looks like it's for the right reasons, and KT is playing very well. Whereas in the spring, it was kind of like, okay, KT drafted well here, but they're not a strong team. Now it feels like, okay, this is a really strong team, and I think we should respect how they played against T1. T1 versus KT, I think, is not what T1 wants either. I think T1 would rather face off against Liiv SANDBOX because obviously, as you and you and I think Liiv SANDBOX.
I mean, they did just get pounded by Liiv SANDBOX, so maybe not. But
so that's the argument everyone always brings up when I say this is like,
but
could they
it
just
was
beat
a
them
meaningless
2-0?
game. Yeah,
it was a meaningless game, and also I think T1 learned a lot from that series and will probably not play Swain again if they do face off against Liiv SANDBOX. So I think that as a watcher of T1, as a caster of T1 this season, I think they will be afraid of facing KT Rolster because of the history this year. And that does something to your mental as a competitor. Like, I am not a pro gamer. I was never really a pro gamer. I was like a semi-pro in StarCraft 2, but not really. But I competed a lot. I fenced. I've played a lot of Smash Bros tournaments growing up. Like I have this moment where I see a player who's crushed me in the past, or I have history with this player, I have history with this fencer I fenced against, and it like gets into my head a little bit. Like, that's something that happens to you as a competitor, just in general. And I think it happens to these players too. Like, I think, yes, you did just get 2-0'd by Liiv SANDBOX. However, KT have played you close all year, like even in your best form. And I think that could get into your head a little bit as T1 preparing for a series like that. Not to mention the fact that in terms of solo laning right now, Faker versus Vikla, it's it feels like a matchup. Whereas we talk about Chovy versus Vikla, like that one feels more realistic. But Faker versus Vikla feels like, in terms of laning, Faker is not dominant right now. I worry about that. I worry about Zeus' current form versus Rascal, who's having his best form in a meta that he can play strong side in. So in that regard, as T1, I'd also be happier playing against Dove. I'd also be happier playing against Closer. The arguments we can have about Prince, I think, are definitely really scary in terms of potentially facing SANDBOX, because Guma and Keria have been struggling in lane, and Keria and Guma have not been getting those prio picks bottom side. So that is one way where you could say, oh, Liiv SANDBOX could be scarier for T1. But I think I'm very happy to predict, unless we see something crazy in those quarters where, maybe one of these two teams looks way better than the other in terms of that best of 5. I feel very confident that we will see Genji versus SANDBOX in that top final, and it will be a Telecom War on the second semi.
Do you think that, are you bold enough to say that KT is actually going to win this if they make it that far? Because I think if KT can take out both the veterans on DAMWON Kia and the veterans on T1 with a rookie, that would be extraordinary. Like, I just don't see both of those things happening.
Right now, I have a feeling like I cannot predict it right now, but I could see it happening. Like, I absolutely can envision it. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, but I don't feel confident predicting that KT will beat T1 today. But after watching their series against DAMWON Kia, I think we will have, when we go into that semis, like, if they look really good against DAMWON Kia, if the 3-0 I think is going to happen actually does happen, and it happens in a very clean manner, and KT don't look exposed in terms of their drafting, they don't look predictable, at that point, I think it's a reasonable prediction. Like, at that point, like, I think I would say yes. The problem is with predictions like this is that we just don't know what's going on with T1. We don't know what their current form is. So that's why I don't feel confident to say, yeah, like, T1 looked pretty bad recently. KT looked really good. Like, so if they win, they'll win again. Like, it's hard for me to do that.
It's also true that we don't have. It was only this last week that LCK was on 12-14. So, with another few days to scrim on this patch, and after having played professionally on it now, teams could adapt very differently to the way the patch is working out.
Yeah. We know that T1, based on their points, from winning spring season, and they're already seeded in semifinals, are going to Worlds. Like this is known. So, um, like in terms of what I want to happen, which we don't talk about very often. We usually just talk about what we think is going to happen. But what I want to happen is I would love to see a 5-game series between KT and T1, where KT wins and goes to the finals against Gen.G. We don't actually see that predictable walkover in semis that happens basically every time in the LCK. And then KT does very well in the Worlds Gauntlet with the points they pick up and go to Worlds, and we get to see a new generation of League of Legends fans experience KT Rolster for the first time at Worlds. Because everybody already knows T1. It's literally the most famous team in the world in esports. It's so famous that non-esports people know it. KT Rolster is such a storied history in Korean esports, even in StarCraft, and people don't know about them. And I think it would be really fun for the new League of Legends fans who didn't watch in KT's heyday back in the old times when you were an LCK caster, to experience KT for the first time, and hopefully they won't disappointed. They won't be disappointed. Maybe they won't get excited. But I think that would be a really fun storyline. I think the same thing of Liiv SANDBOX, of course, and we've talked about it on the show a lot over the past few weeks, like the evolution of DRX. First we're like, ooh, looks pretty good, and now we're not feeling good about that. I'd rather them go than DRX, which I said before, but now especially with DRX's current form.
Yeah, I think DRX is pretty done. Like unless they can put together some kind of crazy miracle run, which, you know, Deft is a great Sivir player. This may be his time. That's a possibility, but it just seems like their development has effectively ceased, and they just don't have the same number of weapons, especially because Gen.G or T1 are overwhelmingly likely to automatically qualify after the summer playoffs are ending. Like if Gen.G wins, then they automatically qualify. T1 will then have the most points, basically, so they should automatically qualify. And then if you have to have that last 2 spots, I think it's just going to be there's no way that DRX can overcome 2 out of the 3 of DAMWON, Kia, KT, and Liiv SANDBOX without a dramatic improvement in their form.
Yeah. There's still a chance Kwangdong goes to the Worlds qualifier if KT is defeated by DAMWON. And it's a small chance, I would say, but it is possible.
That would be very disappointing.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to happen, though. But that's why, spring season points do matter, and KT did not go to playoffs. It's their first playoffs since franchising has started, so... It's been a long time since this team has been dominant. Since their super team, where they won with score, has this team been pretty mediocre, honestly, and was at threat of relegation even at times, actually, and big comeback. So I'm looking forward to seeing how they're going to perform here. As in terms of like predictions for the whole bracket, I think it would be unrealistic to expect anything but a Gen.G victory. I think it's finally time. Chovy is going to lift a trophy. Lehens is going to lift a trophy. Doran's going to get a trophy, and it's actually going to happen. Peanut will lift another one.
Yeah, he doesn't have that many though. He does, compared to how long he's been around and the quality, the caliber of teams that he's played on, he's missed more than he's won.
Still crazy that Ruler is a world champion but does not have an LCK title.
Yeah, it is crazy. All right,
it was one of those. It was one of those things where we had the meme of like it's harder to win the LCK than it is to win Worlds.
That was actually true for many years. That was legitimately true for many years. That it was harder to win LCK. So why the jokes were always that Worlds was the Champions Korea autumn season, right? Except easier. Let's talk about MVPs then, because this. I think there's not that many choices, and basically they're all on Gen.G. Like maybe if you wanted to spin it, Zeus was very good at the start of this season, but finished a little bit middling, I would say. Meanwhile, Gen.G feels like, what do you value here? Do you value the fact that Chovy is still the god of mid lane in terms of his laning phase and has leveled up his game to play better with his teammates? Do you value that this has been an 80 carry-centric meta and Ruler has completely shit on kids the entire season, getting, impressive highlights Zeri play after highlights Zeri play, dominating everybody, it would seem like? Or do you value this resurgence of Peanut, him being incredibly innovative in the sense of defining a jungle pick like Poppy around the world, having extremely creative pathing, and being the brains and the shot caller of this Genji roster. These are all strong candidates.
Yeah, I think all of them are viable. I think Chovy is viable, and I will tell you guys what I voted for. I voted for Ruler, and because we do 1 to 5, I'll tell you guys my top 3. They are all Genji players. They are Ruler, Chovy, and Peanut, and I think there was an argument maybe to be made for Prince.
I agree.
To
I think
be in the conversation.
I think the reason is because Liiv SANDBOX finished 3rd, and that even though Prince, he's still very good, you're glad to see that Closer has stepped up a little bit so that Prince didn't have to carry the burden of this Liiv SANDBOX roster. But without Prince on this roster, this team would be bad. Like straight up. Like they would not, they would be.
And they were in spring without him.
Yeah. They would be maybe 6th, like optimistically, you would have to say. So he has significantly elevated this team. He is a star level player and has shown his worth to this roster. So if your definition of MVP is like, this team would be fucked without this player, Prince is your guy.
Yeah, in terms of most valuable additions, like I used to think about MVP that way, which is why I voted for Gory last year, who literally changed Nongshim from being a terrible team into being a playoff contender. And no one else voted for Gory basically during that time, and I felt like I was the odd man out, but I think my pick was justified. Now I think about MVP as who has had the most iconic and strong plays consistently throughout the year and has just been a strong, consistent top player in their position. So much so that you could never even have a conversation about who was the best AD carry for me. So that's why I voted for Ruler. And this is in a meta where we have players like Prince and Aiming popping off and being incredibly big for their team, and yet still like they're not even close to Ruler. Like I can't even be like, is Ruler the best AD carry or is Aiming? Like you can make an argument for Aiming. No, you cannot. You cannot make an argument for Aiming. You cannot make an argument for Prince. In terms of what they were for their teams, yeah. And Ruler was he as important for his team? No, because he's on a stronger team that has 3 other players that are incredible, 1 other player that's serviceable. And when I think about Ruler this season, one pick stands out. I think most people think about Zeri. I don't. I actually think about Lucian. And he was one of the only players to make late game Lucian look like a real threat, where he's looking for Gale Force angles, he's threatening people, he's ulting tanks and setting up for Peanut to then engage on them. We can blow up the front line and just make Lucian look like a long-range AD carry when he is absolutely not. And he's winning lane with Lucian, he's getting that prio. Then he's in games where he doesn't actually get that attention, where he just has a middling Lucian in lane, he then looks extremely strong in the later parts of the game. And this meta was so defined by bot prio, and he didn't play that much Kalista. Like that's the one pick where I'm like, we didn't see that much of it, but when we did, it was a bad time for the enemy team. I think Peanut's pathing and his popularization of Poppy and how he revolutionized the pick is definitely a strong argument to be made as well. And Chovy just improved as a player so immensely this season on the strong team. I think more than last season. I think Chovy really made huge strides in terms of both laning well. Like he's always been a good laner, but he's pushing his advantages and then spreading that money around the map more than he ever has before. And he is also, in my mind, far and above the best jungle player. For Peanut, there is a counterpart and owner, right? We can actually have that conversation. But for Chovy, there is no one who's even close in my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair that he has been undoubtedly the best mid lane player. I think what is very interesting about Ruler's candidacy, though, is that he is just so insanely efficient as a player right now. And if you guys want to get a sense of that, we talked about Genji a little bit on the last show about how good they are at basically absorbing all of the creeps on the map, like every single minion, every single jungle camp there. They just get more gold. You have to keep that in mind when I talk about Ruler right now. But Ruler is actually one of the lowest economy ADCs in the league. He only gets 29.5% of his team's CS past 15 minutes. Now, keep in mind that Genji is, in fact, getting all of the CS. So it's still a lot of money in terms of the sum total, right? If we're not just, the percentage is low, but the sum total is high, right? And the only one who gets less than him is Deft. However, his damage percent after 15 minutes is second only to aiming. So he's getting the second least amount of CS after 15, but he's doing the second most damage after that same period of time. Keep in mind that on a just purely objective level, he has the fourth highest CS per minute of any ADC, which is a testament to really Gen.G's lane assignments and their ability to just squeeze every last drop of gold out of the map. But that is still insanely impressive that he is what is effectively, by most metrics, a low economy AD carry that is doing the second most damage behind aiming, even above Prince, who, by the way, Prince gets 36%. He gets 7% more of the CS after 15 minutes, and he does less damage by percentage of his team.
We know that Gen.G is, we talked about this last week about, like, we wish there was a stat for, like, how many minions have spawned and how much were taken by them. But we also know that Chovy has some of the highest CS numbers the world has ever seen. Yeah. And so he is, of course, sharing some of that money with Chovy, but Doran is also picking up quite a significant amount of money on the map. So, like you said, it's about how they're setting up their 1-3-1s. They're not really playing 4-1 as much when they have a lead, which is kind of the LCK special, the 4-1, where you're like, yeah, we'll just kind of siege as 4, and then our side laning, top laner, or mid laner will be on the edge there and making sure we're getting value somewhere else. But there's usually a lost lane worth of money during that time because it's just easier to 4-man to grab a turret. But Gen.G are also getting the turrets while having someone else in that side lane and playing 1-3-1 instead. And it is often Ruler who is in 3, making those picks happen, threatening people on the Lucian pick, on the Zeri, whereas hitting, big extendo beams. That's what we like to call it colloquially in the LCK, the W. It would be, I think, dishonest almost if Ruler doesn't get it in my mind.
Yeah, I think Ruler is probably the best candidate.
And he is very likely to win his first season. It all comes together. Like, it just feels like the narrative is set. We just have to watch it unfold.
The stars are aligning, and that's why it would be surprising, especially because this last iteration of T1 versus Gen.G was rather stompy. I mean, I think there is a world where DAMWON Kia comes to life like Frankenstein's monster of all their bits and pieces of weird champions stitched together into one final ferocious form. They're lying in the chair. The lightning finally hits the tower and animates the Frankenstein monster of DAMWON Kia, and they go smash, and then maybe DAMWON Kia can do something. I think that is probably the single best hope for a competitive final.
I want to ask you, if Gen.G does pick Liiv SANDBOX, which we expect, what scoreline do you think Gen.G wins that series with?
3-1 probably.
3-1. Yeah, I think 3-1 is the safe bet on that. I think that Gen.G...
There will be some game where, like, Ruler and Krako, Krako and Prince pop off, right? Like, there is some game where that happens and it just spirals out of control.
It is also, so far on 12-14, a very snowbally meta, especially for the team that has the priority picks, like the Renekton, like playing strong side top, and the team that has the bottom side control. Mid is like the more ambiguous one, obviously, but I could see a world where one game goes very wrong for Gen.G in the early parts, and then it's just too snowbally, they cannot recover with their draft. I could see that happening. But I feel very confident about that one right now. Obviously, earlier we talked about the T1 KT. I do not feel confident to predict that one right now for KT or for T1. We just don't know the form of T1 at the moment. But Gen.G, we can definitely trust. Like, at the end of the season for Gen.G, it was looking the same as it did all season long. Very good, very consistent. Whereas for T1, it was looking very not consistent at the end. So it leaves us kind of questioning where they are at the moment.
I will save Wolf are complaints about the format of the LCK playoffs for next week, because we had a lot to get through this week. And because we're only going to have the finals to talk about next week. We'll recap, obviously, everything that's happened. We'll have a much better sense of who's going to be in the regional qualifiers at that point in time as well. But it's pretty much just going to be the finals. So we can talk about why this system is by far the worst playoff structure out of any major region. It is depressing that it is so short. It is depressing that the quarters and semifinals are played in the same week. That seems like a little bit crazy if you want quarterfinals teams to be able to prepare for their semifinal opponents, create good matches. It's crazy that if that's going to happen, okay, put them both in the same week, but add that little double limb bracket there so that they have a little bit of time to recover. There isn't any reason that this has to be 2 weeks.
You said you were going to save it for next episode. You're getting into it now.
We're going to, and like, yes, I know the regional qualifier kind of is the double elimination bracket when it comes to going to Worlds. Like, it does sort of function that way. But most of these other regional playoffs last like till mid-September, like 2 more weeks after these are over.
I will tease that I have a different opinion about double elimination for the LCK, but we'll get into that.
Well, that's all right. You can tempt us with that, and we'll see you guys next week.